The charred timber still smelled of smoke, even though 3 weeks had passed since the fire had consumed everything Rachel Morrison had called home. And now, she knelt in the blackened dirt with a burlap sack of wildflower seeds beside her, determined to make something beautiful rise from the devastation. Her hands were already dirty, fingers pressing small holes into the ash-streaked soil as the Texas sun beat down on her back. Jefferson had been her home for 2 years now, ever since she had arrived with her late husband Thomas. He had died from fever just 8 months after they had settled here, leaving her alone in the small house on the edge of town. The house that no longer existed. The fire had started in the middle of the night, and she had barely escaped with her life, running into the darkness in nothing but her nightgown. The townspeople had been kind, offering her a room above the general store and enough donated clothes to see her through. But the loss of everything she owned had left a hollow ache in her chest that would not fade. She had turned 23 just last week, and it felt strange to mark another year when so much had been taken away. But this morning, staring at the blackened plot of land, she had decided that wallowing would not rebuild her life. If she could not afford to reconstruct the house yet, she could at least plant something that would grow. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house had given her the seeds, wildflowers native to East Texas that would bloom in brilliant colors if they took root. Rachel had accepted them with grateful tears and walked the half-mile to her ruined property with purpose in her stride. The earth was stubborn, though. Packed hard beneath the layer of ash, it resisted her attempts to dig proper holes. She had brought a small trowel from the general store, but it bent against the unyielding ground. Frustration built in her throat as she stabbed at the dirt again and again, achieving little more than shallow scratches. Sweat dripped down her temple, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of soot across her cheek. That is not going to work. The voice startled her so badly that she dropped the trowel. Rachel spun around, one hand pressed to her racing heart, and found herself looking up at a man on horseback. He sat easy in the saddle, a tall figure silhouetted against the mid-morning sun. As her eyes adjusted, she took in the details: broad shoulders, a worn brown hat pulled low, sun-darkened skin, and eyes that were a surprising shade of blue-green. He looked to be in his late 20s, with the weathered appearance of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. "I apologize for startling you, madam," he said, swinging down from his horse with practiced grace. "I was riding past and saw you struggling. That ground is going to need something stronger than a trowel." Rachel got to her feet, brushing ash from her skirt. She was acutely aware that she must look a mess, her brown hair escaping from its braid and her second-hand dress already filthy. "I am making do with what I have. I can see that." He walked closer, studying the burned foundation and the small patches where she had tried to dig. His expression was thoughtful rather than pitying, which Rachel appreciated. Most people in town looked at her with such obvious sympathy that it made her want to hide. "You are planting flowers here." "Yes." She lifted her chin slightly, defensive. "Is there something wrong with that?" "Not at all." He crouched down, running his fingers through the ash and hard, packed earth beneath. "In fact, I think it is about the best idea I have heard in a long time. This place needs something living." He looked up at her, and the kindness in his eyes caught her off guard. "I have a proper spade on my saddle. Would you allow me to help you dig?" Rachel hesitated. She did not know this man, and Jefferson was small enough that she recognized most faces. "I do not want charity." "It is not charity, it is neighborly." He stood, dusting off his hands. "And I could use some purpose today myself. Been riding since dawn with nothing but my own thoughts for company, and that gets tiresome." He extended a hand. "Name is Samuel Morgan. I have a small ranch about 5 miles north of here, mostly cattle, some horses." She shook his hand, noting the calluses and the firm grip. "Rachel Morrison, this was my home. I heard about the fire. I am sorry for your loss." The words were simple, but his tone carried genuine sympathy without the cloying pity she had grown to dread. "Let me get that spade." Before she could protest further, he walked back to his horse, a sturdy chestnut mare, and retrieved a well-used spade from where it was strapped to his saddle. He also pulled down a canteen. "You should drink something. It is hot today." Rachel accepted the canteen, taking a careful sip of the cool water inside. It soothed her parched throat, and she drank more deeply before handing it back. "Thank you." Samuel nodded and moved to where she had been trying to dig. He positioned the spade and drove it into the ground with a firm push of his boot. The blade sank deep, and he leveraged up a chunk of earth with ease. "Where do you want the holes?" She pointed to the spots she had marked with small stones. "I was thinking of creating a border around where the house stood, something to mark that this place mattered." "That sounds right." He continued digging, creating proper deep holes that would give the roots room to grow. Rachel watched for a moment, then knelt beside him and began placing seeds in each completed hole, covering them gently with loose soil. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the bite of the spade into earth and the distant call of crows. Rachel found the rhythm soothing and the presence of this stranger oddly comforting. He did not ask invasive questions or offer empty platitudes. He simply dug. After they had completed a dozen holes, Samuel paused to wipe his brow. "You know, there is an old saying my mother used to tell me. New life from old ashes. She said it whenever something bad happened to remind us that endings make room for beginnings." Rachel sat back on her heels, looking at the seeds they had planted. "New life from old ashes," she repeated softly. "I like that. It feels true. My mother was a wise woman." There was sadness in his voice, old but still present. "She passed 5 years ago. Sometimes I still hear her voice in my head giving advice. I am sorry." Rachel understood loss intimately. "My husband died not long after we moved here. Fever took him in 3 days. I keep thinking I hear his footsteps sometimes, then I remember." Samuel met her eyes and something passed between them in that moment, an unspoken understanding of grief. "It is hard being alone." "Yes," she agreed quietly, "it is." He cleared his throat and returned to digging, but the silence now felt weighted with shared experience rather than mere politeness. Rachel continued planting, her fingers working the seeds into the dark earth. The repetitive motion was almost meditative, and she found her mind wandering to the future for the first time in weeks. What would these flowers look like when they bloomed? Would she still be living above the general store, or would she have found a way to rebuild? What kind of flowers are these? Samuel asked, breaking into her thoughts. "Wildflowers. Mrs. Henderson said there are bluebonnets, Indian paintbrush, and black-eyed Susans mixed in. They should bloom in the spring if they survive." "They will survive. This is good soil under all the ash. Once the roots take hold, they will thrive." He finished another hole and paused, leaning on the spade. "Have you thought about rebuilding the house?" Rachel laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "Every day. But I have no money for lumber and I cannot do the work myself. I have been saving every penny from my job at the dress shop, but it will take years to afford even a small cabin. There are men in town who would help with the labor if you could get the materials. They have their own families and farms to tend. I will not ask them to donate their time to me." She shook her head firmly. "I will manage on my own somehow." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "You are stubborn. I am practical. Those are not always the same thing." But he smiled slightly, softening the words. Stubborn is not necessarily bad. It means you will not give up. I cannot afford to give up. Rachel pressed another seed into the earth, covering it carefully. This is all I have left, this plot of land and the memories of what used to be here. Then we will make sure these flowers grow. Samuel drove the spade in again with renewed energy. And maybe other things will grow too in time. They continued working as the sun climbed higher, the heat becoming oppressive. Rachel's dress clung to her back, damp with perspiration, and her face felt flushed. Samuel had removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing strong forearms tanned dark by the sun. She tried not to stare, focusing instead on the task at hand, but she found herself oddly aware of his presence, the way he moved with easy strength, the rare smile that softened his serious face. By noon, they had planted seeds all along the front border of the property and had started on the sides. Rachel's water was long gone, and Samuel shared his canteen freely. When her stomach rumbled audibly, she felt her face heat with embarrassment. Samuel chuckled. I am hungry too. There is a stand of cottonwoods about a quarter-mile that way with a creek running through. Good shade and cold water. We could take a rest, and I have some jerky and biscuits in my saddle bag that I am happy to share. Rachel wanted to refuse, to maintain her independence, but her growling stomach and the blazing sun made the offer too tempting. That would be very kind. Thank you. He gathered his tools and helped her to her feet. Her legs had gone stiff from kneeling so long, and she stumbled slightly. Samuel caught her elbow, steadying her. Easy now. I am fine, she said quickly, but she did not pull away immediately. His hand was warm through the thin fabric of her sleeve, and the casual touch sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. When she finally stepped back, she felt flustered and confused by her own reaction. Samuel pretended not to notice, busying himself with tying the spade back onto his saddle. He offered his arm. Would you like to ride? The mare can carry us both easily enough. I can walk. I know you can. But you have been working hard all morning, and there is no shame in accepting a ride. Rachel considered this. Her pride warred with her exhaustion, and exhaustion won. All right, thank you. He helped her up onto the horse first, then swung up behind her with easy grace. Rachel stiffened at the sudden intimacy of the position, acutely aware of his chest against her back, his arms reaching around her to take the reins. The horse started forward at his gentle urging, and Rachel gripped the saddle horn tightly. Relax, Samuel said softly, close to her ear. I will not let you fall. She tried to do as he said, forcing her tense muscles to loosen. After a few moments, the steady rhythm of the horse's walk and the security of Samuel's presence behind her did help her relax. The ride to the cottonwoods was short, and soon they were dismounting in the blessed shade beside a narrow creek that gurgled over smooth stones. Rachel immediately knelt by the water and splashed her face, the cold shocking and wonderful. She drank deeply, cupping the water in her hands, and felt some of her energy return. When she looked up, Samuel was spreading a blanket on the ground beneath the largest tree and laying out the food he had mentioned. It is not much, he said apologetically, but it is better than nothing. Rachel settled on the blanket beside him, accepting the jerky and biscuits with genuine gratitude. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, and Rachel realized with some surprise that she felt more at ease than she had in weeks. There was something calming about Samuel Morgan, a quiet steadiness that made her feel safe. Why did you really stop to help me? She asked eventually, curiosity getting the better of her. You said you were just riding by, but this is not exactly on the main road. Samuel considered the question, chewing thoughtfully. Honest answer. I saw you from a distance and recognized the stubborn set of someone trying to do something impossible alone. reminded me of myself after my mother died. I tried to run the whole ranch by myself for months, refusing help, until I nearly worked myself to death. My neighbor finally knocked some sense into me, literally knocked me down when I collapsed from exhaustion. After that, I learned that accepting help is not weakness. I do not want to be a burden on anyone. Helping you plant flowers for a few hours is not a burden, it is just being decent. He met her eyes directly. You are allowed to let people be kind to you, Rachel. The way he said her name, with that gentle firmness, made something tight in her chest loosen. She looked away, blinking against sudden tears. I am not used to kindness without expectation. What do you mean? After Thomas died, there were men in town who offered to help me, but their help came with implications. Suggestions that I should remarry quickly, that I needed a man to take care of me. One even proposed within a month of my husband's death. The memory still made her angry. I stopped accepting help after that because I was tired of fighting off unwanted advances. Samuel's expression darkened. That is despicable. You were grieving. They saw an opportunity, a young widow with property and no family. Rachel twisted her hands in her lap. That is why I am wary. I apologize if I seemed rude earlier. You were not rude. You were cautious, and you have every right to be. He was quiet for a moment, then added carefully, For what it is worth, I am not looking for a wife, and I am not trying to take advantage. I just saw someone who needed help, and I had time to give it. Nothing more complicated than that. Rachel studied his face, searching for signs of deception, but found only sincerity. Thank you. I appreciate that. You are welcome. He offered her more jerky, and she accepted, her appetite returning now that the air had been cleared between them. They talked more easily after that, sharing stories about their lives. Samuel told her about his ranch, the struggles of managing cattle in the unpredictable Texas weather, the satisfaction of breeding strong horses. Rachel spoke about her work at the dress shop, the intricate embroidery she enjoyed, her dream of one day designing her own dress patterns. The conversation flowed naturally, and Rachel was surprised by how much she enjoyed his company. When the sun began its descent toward afternoon, they returned to the burned property and resumed their work. The remaining seeds were planted by late afternoon, and Rachel stood back to survey what they had accomplished. The border of freshly turned earth looked dark and rich against the gray ash, a promise of future beauty. Thank you, she said, turning to Samuel. I could not have done this without you. You would have found a way. He coiled the rope attached to his canteen and secured it to his saddle. You are resourceful, stubborn, you mean. That too. His smile was warm, reaching his eyes, but I meant it as a compliment. Rachel found herself smiling back, a real smile that felt strange on her face after so many weeks of grief. Would you like to come back sometime, to see if the flowers grow? The words were out before she could second-guess them, and she immediately felt foolish. But Samuel's expression brightened. I would like that very much. Perhaps next week. I could bring some proper fencing materials. Once these flowers bloom, you will want to protect them from wandering cattle. You do not have to do that, I know, but I would like to, if you will allow it. Rachel nodded slowly. I would appreciate that. Thank you, Samuel. You are welcome, Rachel. He mounted his horse, settling into the saddle with easy familiarity. He touched the brim of his hat in farewell, a gesture that struck her as both old-fashioned and charming. Take care of yourself. I will. You too. She watched him ride away, the horse and rider gradually disappearing down the dusty road toward the north. Only when he was completely out of sight did she turn back to her planted flowers, a strange warmth blooming in her chest that had nothing to do with the Texas heat. The walk back to town felt shorter than usual, her steps light despite her exhaustion. She returned to her small room above the general store and collapsed onto the narrow bed, her muscles aching but her spirit lighter than it had been in a long time. As she drifted toward sleep, she found herself thinking about Samuel Morgan's kind eyes and the words he had spoken. New life from old ashes. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps something beautiful could grow from devastation after all. The following week passed slowly, each day bleeding into the next in a routine of work and worry. Rachel spent her mornings at the dress shop, sewing hems and attaching buttons under the critical eye of Mrs. Patterson, the shop's owner. The work was tedious but necessary, each penny earned bringing her infinitesimally closer to the dream of rebuilding. In the evenings, she would walk to her property and check on the planted seeds, looking for any sign of green pushing through the dark soil. By Wednesday, tiny sprouts had emerged, fragile but determined. Rachel had knelt beside them with tears in her eyes, overcome by the simple miracle of growth. Something was growing from the ashes. Something was surviving. On Saturday morning, she made the walk to her property earlier than usual, carrying a bucket of water from the town well. The sprouts would need help in this dry season if they were going to establish strong roots. She was carefully watering each emerging plant when she heard the familiar sound of hoofbeats. Her heart gave an unexpected leap, and she turned to see Samuel riding toward her, his chestnut mare pulling a small cart laden with wooden posts and wire fencing. He wore the same brown hat and a work shirt that had clearly seen many washings, and his face broke into a smile when he saw her. "Good morning," he called, bringing the horse to a stop. "I see we had some success." Rachel gestured to the tiny green shoots. "They started coming up 3 days ago. I have been watering them each morning. They look healthy." He dismounted and walked over to examine the sprouts more closely, crouching down with the careful attention of someone who understood growing things. "Give them another few weeks and they will be well established." "I hope so." Rachel set down her bucket. "You brought fencing." "I did. Figured we could set up a simple barrier, nothing fancy, just enough to keep livestock from trampling them." He straightened, looking at the property with an assessing eye. "It will not take long if we work together." They spent the morning setting fence posts into the ground, Samuel doing the heavy work of digging and securing while Rachel helped hold posts straight and unroll wire. It was hard labor, but satisfying in a way that Rachel's dress shop work never was. Here, she could see immediate results, tangible progress. As they worked, they talked more freely than before, the initial awkwardness of strangers fading into something easier. Samuel told her about a difficult calf birth he had helped with earlier in the week, his words painting a vivid picture of the struggle and relief when both mother and baby survived. Rachel shared a story about a particularly demanding customer at the dress shop who had changed her mind about fabric choices 5 times before finally settling on her original selection. "You have patience," Samuel observed, securing another wire to a post. "That kind of indecision would drive me mad." "Some days it does," Rachel admitted, "but I need the work, so I smile and accommodate. You should be designing those dresses yourself, not just sewing them for others." The comment caught her off guard. "How did you know I wanted to design?" "You mentioned it last week by the creek. You said you had dreams of creating your own patterns." He glanced at her with those perceptive blue-green eyes. "I pay attention." Something in his tone made her pulse quicken, but she pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the wire in her hands. "Designing dresses requires money for materials and a reputation. I have neither. Not yet, but circumstances change." He moved to the next post and she followed. "A year ago, I could barely keep my ranch afloat. This year, I have a contract to supply horses to the army." Things can turn around faster than you expect. That sounds like dangerous optimism. Maybe, or maybe it is just experience talking. He secured the last section of wire and stepped back to survey their work. There, that should keep your flowers safe. The simple fence was not beautiful, but it was functional and sturdy, surrounding the sprouting flowers with clear protection. Rachel felt a rush of gratitude so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. Samuel, I do not know how to thank you properly. You have given so much time and materials, and I have nothing to offer in return. You do not owe me anything. He began gathering his tools, his movements unhurried. But if you are determined to offer something, you could let me take you to supper tonight. There is a decent restaurant in Jefferson, or so I have heard. I have never actually been there because eating alone in restaurants seems depressing, but I would enjoy the company if you would join me. Rachel's breath caught. It was not a subtle invitation, not something she could interpret as mere friendliness. He was asking to spend more time with her, in a context that felt decidedly more personal than planting flowers or building fences. I do not know if that is a good idea, she said slowly, even as part of her wanted to say yes immediately. Why not? Because I told you about those men who offered help with expectations, and now you are asking me to supper, and it feels like maybe there are expectations after all. Samuel was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful rather than offended. That is fair. Let me be clear then, so there is no confusion. Yes, I am asking to spend time with you because I enjoy your company and I find you interesting. But I am not asking you to marry me or obligating you to anything. It is just supper. If you say yes, we will eat and talk, and afterward, I will walk you home and say good night. If you say no, I will respect that, and it will not change the fact that I was happy to help with your flowers. There is no expectation either way except honesty. His directness was refreshing, cutting through the games and implications that so many others used. Rachel appreciated it more than she could express. She considered his offer carefully, weighing her wariness against the undeniable pull she felt toward this man who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. "All right," she said finally. "I would like to have supper with you." The smile that spread across Samuel's face was bright enough to rival the Texas sun. "Good. That makes me very happy. Shall I pick you up at 6? 6 is fine. I am staying above the general store. The entrance is on the side. I will find it." He loaded his tools back into the cart, his movements carrying a new energy. "I am looking forward to it, Rachel." "So am I," she admitted, and was surprised to realize it was true. He rode away with a wave, and Rachel remained by her fenced flowers, her mind spinning with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. It had been so long since she had thought of herself as anything other than a widow, a survivor, a woman alone. The idea of being someone who went to supper with a handsome cowboy felt foreign and exciting and terrifying all at once. She returned to her room and went through her meager wardrobe with a critical eye. Most of her clothing was practical and plain, second-hand donations that served their purpose, but were hardly flattering. Finally, she settled on a dark blue dress that had belonged to someone with better taste than luck. It fit reasonably well, and the color brought out the brown of her eyes. She would need to wash and properly arrange her hair, and she had a small bottle of rose water that she had been saving for a special occasion. Was this a special occasion? Rachel was not sure, but it felt important enough to warrant the effort. The hours until 6 passed in a strange blur of nervous energy. She worked her usual shift at the dress shop, her mind only half on the seams she was stitching. Mrs. Patterson commented twice that she seemed distracted, but Rachel deflected with vague explanations about being tired. When the shop finally closed at 5, She rushed back to her room and began preparing with the focus of a general planning a campaign. By the time 6 o'clock arrived, she had washed, dressed, and arranged her hair in a simple but neat style. She had even managed to remove most of the soot stains from under her fingernails, though her hands still bore the rough evidence of manual labor. She studied herself in the small mirror above her wash basin and decided she looked acceptable, if not elegant. The knock on her door came precisely at 6. Samuel stood in the narrow hallway wearing clean clothes and a jacket that looked new or at least well preserved. His hair was damp, as though he had recently washed it, and he held his hat in his hands rather than on his head. He looked nervous, which somehow made Rachel feel calmer. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you. You look nice as well." They walked together through the streets of Jefferson as the evening sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. The restaurant Samuel had mentioned was called the Riverside Inn, a modest establishment near the cypress-lined banks of the Big Cypress Bayou. It was nicer than anywhere Rachel had eaten since arriving in Texas, with actual tablecloths and candles. The owner, a round-faced woman named Mrs. Chen, greeted Samuel with friendly recognition. "Mr. Morgan, good to see you finally taking my advice to bring someone for supper, and such a lovely companion too." Samuel had the grace to look embarrassed. "Mrs. Chen has been telling me for months that I work too much and should socialize more. He comes to town for supplies and then rides straight back to his ranch," Mrs. Chen explained to Rachel with exaggerated exasperation. "Never stops to talk, never stays for a meal. I tell him, what is the point of being young and handsome if you spend all your time with cows?" "The cows are less complicated," Samuel said dryly, but he was smiling. Mrs. Chen showed them to a corner table with a view of the water and left them with menus, promising to return shortly. Rachel studied the options, trying to calculate costs in her head. Everything seemed expensive compared to her usual meals of bread and cheese. "Order whatever you like," Samuel said, as if reading her thoughts. "My treat, and I mean that." Rachel chose the chicken with vegetables while Samuel ordered steak. When Mrs. Chen returned with their drinks, lemonade for both of them, Samuel raised his glass. "To new growth," he said. Rachel clinked her glass against his. "To new growth." The meal was excellent, the chicken tender and seasoned with herbs that reminded Rachel of her mother's cooking back in Missouri. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily from topic to topic. They discovered shared opinions on the corruption of local politics, disagreed amiably about the best way to break a horse, and found common ground in their love of thunderstorms. "There is something about the smell of rain on dry earth," Rachel said, gesturing with her fork. "It feels like hope." "Petrichor," Samuel said. "What?" "That is the word for that smell, petrichor. I read it in a book once and it stuck with me because it is such a perfect word for such a specific thing." "You read?" Rachel did not mean it to sound surprised, but Samuel laughed. "I know, shocking for a cowboy, but my mother was a teacher before she married and she made sure I learned. I have a whole shelf of books back at the ranch, mostly agricultural texts and some history, but a few novels too." "What kind of novels?" "Do not laugh, but I have a weakness for adventure stories, treasure islands and lost cities, that sort of thing." He looked almost sheepish. "Escapism, I suppose. When I am reading about someone searching for pirate gold, I am not thinking about drought or cattle prices." Rachel smiled. "I do not think that is anything to be embarrassed about. I read romances for the same reason. They remind me that happy endings are possible." "Do you believe in happy endings?" The question was casual, but his eyes were intent on her face. Rachel considered it seriously. "I want to. I think I used to before Thomas died. Now I am not sure, but I am trying to believe again." That is brave or foolish. No, his voice was firm. Choosing hope after loss is the bravest thing a person can do. The sincerity in his words made her throat tight with emotion. She looked down at her plate, blinking back the sting of tears. When she had composed herself, she met his gaze again. "Thank you for understanding that." "I lost my father when I was 12, Samuel said quietly. "Accident with a horse, then my mother 5 years ago, like I mentioned. I know what it is to lose people who matter. I know how hard it is to keep going." They sat in shared silence for a moment, the weight of grief acknowledged but not dwelt upon. Mrs. Chen returned to clear their plates and offer dessert, which they declined in favor of coffee. As they sipped the strong, bitter brew, Rachel found herself studying Samuel's face in the candlelight, noting the small scar above his left eyebrow, the laugh lines just beginning to form at the corners of his eyes, the way his mouth curved when he was thinking. He was handsome, she realized with a start. She had noticed it in an abstract way before, but now she truly saw it, and the awareness sent warmth through her veins. "What are you thinking?" he asked, catching her staring. "That I am glad I said yes to supper." His smile was slow and genuine. "I am glad you said yes too." They lingered over coffee until the restaurant began to empty, the other diners drifting away into the evening. Finally, Samuel paid the bill despite Rachel's half-hearted protest, and they stepped out into the warm night air. The streets of Jefferson were quiet, lit by occasional lanterns hung outside businesses and homes. Samuel offered his arm and Rachel took it, acutely aware of the solid warmth of him beside her. They walked slowly, in no hurry to end the evening. When they reached the general store, Rachel felt a pang of disappointment. "Thank you for supper," she said, reluctant to let go of his arm. "I had a wonderful time." "So did I." Samuel hesitated, then said, "Would you allow me to see you again? Not for work this time, just to spend time together." "I would like that very much." "Good." He seemed relieved, as if he had genuinely worried she might refuse. "Perhaps next Sunday. I could take you riding if you would like. I have a gentle mare that would suit you. I have not ridden in years. It will come back to you." "Riding is like swimming, you do not forget." Rachel laughed at the comparison. "All right, Sunday riding it is." They stood for a moment longer, neither quite willing to say goodbye. Finally, Samuel took a small step back, putting proper distance between them. "Good night, Rachel." "Good night, Samuel." She watched him walk away into the darkness, his figure eventually disappearing around a corner. Only then did she climb the stairs to her room, her heart full of something she had not felt in a very long time. It took her a while to identify the emotion, and when she did, it both thrilled and frightened her. It was happiness. Pure, uncomplicated happiness. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a pleasant breeze that tempered the Texas heat. Rachel wore her most practical dress and the sturdy boots she used for walking to her property. Samuel arrived at 10 with 2 horses, his chestnut mare and a smaller gray mare with a gentle eye. "This is Rosie," Samuel introduced, stroking the gray mare's neck. "She is the sweetest horse I own. She will take good care of you." Rachel approached cautiously, extending her hand for Rosie to sniff. The mare nuzzled her palm, and Rachel felt some of her nervousness fade. "Hello, Rosie. Be patient with me, all right." Samuel helped her mount, his hand steadying her waist as she found her seat in the saddle. The height was intimidating at first, but Rosie stood perfectly still, waiting patiently for Rachel to adjust. Once she was settled, Samuel handed her the reins and demonstrated the proper hold. "Gentle pressure to guide her," he explained. "She knows her job, so mostly you just need to sit and let her do it. If you want to stop, pull back gently. To go faster, press with your heels, but we will keep it to a walk today." They rode out of town, heading east, following a trail that wound through pine forests and open meadows. The motion of the horse beneath her was strange at first, but Rachel gradually relaxed into the rhythm, finding it almost meditative. Samuel rode beside her, close enough to help if needed but giving her space to find her confidence. The countryside was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that still sometimes surprised Rachel after growing up in more cultivated Missouri. Here, nature dominated, vast and indifferent to human concerns. They passed through stands of towering pines, their scent sharp and clean, and crossed a shallow creek where the horses paused to drink. "You are a natural," Samuel said, watching her handle Rosie with growing ease. "I knew you would be." "I am beginning to remember why I enjoyed it as a child," Rachel admitted. "There is something freeing about it." "That is exactly it. When I am riding, nothing else matters. It is just me and the horse and the land." They rode for over an hour, eventually reaching a high point that overlooked miles of forest broken by occasional clearings. Samuel dismounted and helped Rachel down, and they stood together at the edge of the overlook, taking in the view. "It is beautiful," Rachel breathed. "It is. I come here sometimes when I need to think. Something about the perspective helps clear my head." He glanced at her. "I am glad I could share it with you." They sat on a flat rock, the horses grazing peacefully nearby. Samuel had brought water and some fruit, which they shared while talking about everything and nothing. Rachel told him about her childhood in Missouri, growing up as the youngest of 4 children in a family that struggled but loved fiercely. Samuel shared stories of learning ranching from his father, the pride and terror of taking over the operation after his parents died. "You ever get lonely out there?" Rachel asked. 5 miles from town with no one but yourself." "Sometimes," he admitted. "I have ranch hands who come by during busy seasons, but mostly it is just me. There are nights when the silence feels too heavy, and I wonder what I am doing with my life." He plucked a blade of grass, twisting it between his fingers. "That is part of why I stopped to help you that day. I saw someone else fighting against loneliness, and it felt important to reach out." "I am glad you did." Rachel's voice was soft. "I did not realize how isolated I had become until you showed up. I had convinced myself that I was fine alone, that I did not need anyone, but I was wrong." "We are not meant to be solitary creatures," Samuel said. "People need people, even stubborn ones like us." Rachel laughed at that, the sound carrying across the open space. "I suppose you are right." They stayed on the overlook until the sun reached its peak, then reluctantly mounted the horses for the ride back. The return journey felt shorter, both of them comfortable in the saddle and in each other's presence. When they reached town, Samuel insisted on walking Rachel to her door despite her protests that he had already given enough of his day. "I am not ready to say goodbye yet," he said simply, and Rachel's heart skipped at the honest admission. At her door they lingered again, neither wanting the day to end. Finally, Samuel cleared his throat. "Rachel, I want to be clear about my intentions. I am not playing games or passing time. I am interested in you, genuinely interested, and I would like to continue seeing you if you feel the same way." Rachel's pulse raced, but she kept her voice steady. "I feel the same way. But Samuel, I am still healing from losing Thomas. Some days I feel ready to move forward, and other days the grief hits me all over again. I do not want to hurt you by being inconsistent." "Grief is not something you overcome and leave behind," Samuel said gently. "It is something you learn to carry. I do not expect you to forget your husband or stop loving his memory. I am just asking if there might be room in your heart for something new, even while you carry that old love." The compassion and understanding in his words nearly undid her. "Yes," she whispered. "I think there might be room. I want there to be room. Then that is enough for now." He reached for her hand, holding it carefully as if she were something precious. "We will take this slow. No pressure, no expectations beyond honesty. All right, all right." He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The old-fashioned gesture made her blush, and his eyes crinkled with amusement at her reaction. "I will see you soon, Rachel Morrison." "Soon," she echoed, and watched him walk away for what felt like the 100th time, each parting a little harder than the last. The weeks that followed established a pattern. Samuel would come to town twice a week, usually on Wednesday evenings and Sunday afternoons. They would spend time together, sometimes at her property checking on the growing flowers, sometimes riding through the countryside, occasionally having supper at the riverside inn where Mrs. Chen greeted them like family. Rachel began to rely on those meetings, marking time by Samuel's visits, counting the days until she would see him again. The flowers grew steadily, transforming from fragile sprouts into healthy plants that promised vibrant blooms. Rachel tended them faithfully, and Samuel helped when he was there, the two of them working side by side in comfortable companionship. The physical labor became a form of meditation, their conversations flowing freely as their hands worked the earth. In late September, the first bluebonnets bloomed, their purple petals vivid against the dark soil. Rachel discovered them on a Wednesday morning and immediately sent word to Samuel through a boy in town who sometimes ran errands for spare change. Samuel arrived that afternoon, abandoning whatever work he had planned, and they stood together admiring the flowers like proud parents. "New life from old ashes," Rachel said, echoing his words from that first day. "I was right," Samuel said, his voice warm with satisfaction. "They are beautiful." "They are." Rachel felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by the simple miracle of growth and survival. "Thank you, Samuel, for everything." He pulled her into a hug, and Rachel went willingly, resting her head against his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. They had grown more comfortable with casual touch over the weeks, his hand on her back, her fingers brushing his arm, small gestures that spoke of growing intimacy without crossing into impropriety. "You do not need to thank me," he murmured into her hair. "Being part of this part of your life is a gift to me." Rachel pulled back just enough to look up at his face. "Samuel, I need to tell you something." He looked suddenly worried. "What is it?" "I am falling in love with you." The words came out in a rush, unplanned but undeniably true. "I do not know when it started, maybe that first day, maybe later, but it is happening, and I thought you should know." For a moment, Samuel just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his face broke into a smile so wide and joyful that it transformed him. "Rachel Morrison, I have been in love with you since you glared at me and said you did not want charity. I was just waiting for you to catch up." She laughed, giddy with relief and happiness. "You could have said something sooner. I wanted you to be sure. I wanted to give you time." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "But now that you are sure, can I kiss you?" "Yes," she breathed, and he did. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, both of them learning the shape and taste of the other. Then Rachel rose on her toes, pressing closer, and the kiss deepened into something more passionate. Samuel's arms came around her waist, holding her securely, and Rachel let herself fall into the sensation, into the rightness of being held and wanted and cherished. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for weeks." "I have wanted you to," Rachel admitted, her cheeks flushed. They spent the rest of the afternoon at her property, sitting among the blooming flowers and talking about the future with a new openness. Samuel spoke of his hope to expand the ranch, maybe buy the adjacent property if it ever came up for sale. Rachel shared her dream of designing dresses, perhaps opening a small shop of her own someday. They made no concrete plans, but the unspoken understanding was there. Whatever futures they envisioned now included each other. As fall progressed into early winter, their relationship deepened. Samuel introduced Rachel to his ranch, showing her the operation with pride and answering her endless questions about cattle and horses. Rachel brought him to the dress shop, and Mrs. Patterson commented approvingly that it was about time Rachel started living again. The townspeople of Jefferson began to accept them as a couple, greeting them together with knowing smiles. In November, Samuel asked Rachel to marry him. They were at the overlook where they had ridden on their first outing, the autumn sun painting the landscape in shades of gold and red. He had no ring, just his honest words and hopeful heart. "I know it has only been a few months," he said, holding both her hands in his. "But I am sure about you. I want to build a life together, raise a family, grow old watching flowers bloom in that patch of earth where we met. Will you marry me, Rachel?" Rachel did not hesitate. "Yes, absolutely yes." They married in December at the small church in Jefferson, a simple ceremony attended by the townspeople who had watched their courtship with approval. Rachel wore a dress she had designed and sewn herself, ivory muslin with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Samuel wore his best suit, and his hands shook slightly as he slid a simple gold band onto her finger. "I love you," he said as they were pronounced husband and wife. "I love you too," she replied, and meant it with her whole heart. The first year of their marriage was an adjustment, learning to share space and lives after so long alone. Rachel moved to the ranch, and together they renovated the house, adding a larger kitchen and a workroom where Rachel could design her dresses. Samuel supported her ambition wholeheartedly, even helping her secure a small loan to purchase quality fabrics. By spring, she had her first commission, a wedding dress for the daughter of a prominent Jefferson family. They worked hard, both of them, Samuel managing the ranch while Rachel built her reputation as a designer. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over their land, talking about their days and making plans for the future. The intimacy between them grew, physical and emotional, until Rachel could not remember what loneliness felt like. In May, almost exactly a year after they had met, Rachel told Samuel she was pregnant. His reaction was pure joy, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to stop before she got dizzy. They celebrated by riding to the property where they had first met, where the wildflowers were in full bloom again, even more vibrant than the year before. "New life from old ashes," Samuel said, his hand resting on her still flat stomach. "New life," Rachel agreed, covering his hand with hers. Their son was born in January of 1878, a healthy baby with his father's blue-green eyes and his mother's stubborn spirit. They named him Thomas Samuel, honoring both the past and the present. Samuel proved to be a devoted father, patient and gentle with the squirming infant, walking the floors at night when the baby cried so Rachel could rest. "You are good at this," Rachel observed one night, watching him soothe Thomas with practiced ease. "I had a good teacher," Samuel said, referring to his own mother. "And I love him. That makes everything else easier." As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, their lives settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch prospered, Samuel's horse breeding program gaining recognition throughout Texas. Rachel's dress business thrived, her designs becoming sought after by women throughout Jefferson and the surrounding area. They hired help for both enterprises, a ranch hand named Jack who had a way with cattle, and a young woman named Emma who apprenticed with Rachel and showed real talent. The property where Rachel's first house had burned remained a flower garden, tended carefully each year. They never built on it, choosing instead to let it stand as a reminder of where their story began. Thomas loved playing among the flowers, his chubby toddler legs carrying him between the blooms while Rachel and Samuel watched with proud smiles. In the summer of 1880, Rachel gave birth to their daughter, a tiny girl with dark hair and her mother's brown eyes. They named her Sarah Elizabeth, and Thomas took his role as big brother with endearing seriousness, constantly checking on the baby and bringing her his favorite toys. Life was not without challenges. There were droughts that threatened the cattle, illnesses that frightened them, financial worries that kept them awake at night. But they faced everything together, united in their commitment to each other and their family. The love that had begun in a patch of burned earth proved strong enough to weather any storm. By 1882, their family felt complete. Thomas was a rambunctious 4-year-old who wanted to be a cowboy like his father. Sarah was a sweet 2-year-old who followed Rachel everywhere, already showing an interest in fabrics and colors. The ranch was successful, the dress business was thriving, and Rachel and Samuel had built a life rich in love and purpose. One evening in early spring, they walked together to the flower garden, the children playing nearby under Jack's watchful eye. The wildflowers were just beginning to bloom again, the annual resurrection that never stopped amazing Rachel. "You remember what you said that first day?" she asked Samuel, leaning into his side as his arm came around her waist. New life from old ashes. He kissed the top of her head. "I meant it then, and it is still true. Look at everything that has grown from that burned place." Rachel surveyed the vibrant flowers, the healthy children, the man beside her who had helped her rebuild not just a garden but an entire life. "I never imagined I could be this happy. After losing Thomas, after the fire, I thought joy was something that happened to other people." "Joy finds us if we let it," Samuel said. "You let it in. You planted seeds even when everything seemed hopeless. That took courage." "You helped me dig," she reminded him. "I just provided the spade. You had the vision." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. Thomas ran over, excited about something Jack had shown him, and Sarah toddled behind demanding to be picked up. Samuel scooped up his daughter while Rachel listened to her son's breathless explanation of how cattle were branded. This, Rachel thought, holding Thomas's hand while watching her husband and daughter. This was the happy ending she had stopped believing in. Not a return to what was lost, but something new and different and beautiful. A life built from ashes, blooming with color and love. The years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of seasons. Thomas grew tall and serious, apprenticing under his father and learning the ranch business with dedicated focus. Sarah inherited her mother's eye for design, spending hours in the workroom creating sketches and eventually sewing her own dresses. Rachel's reputation as a designer spread beyond Jefferson, and women from as far as Dallas would write requesting her services. Samuel's ranch became one of the most respected in East Texas, known for quality horses and well-managed cattle. But despite their success, neither of them forgot where they had started. Every year on the anniversary of their meeting, they would walk to the flower garden and plant new seeds together, renewing the promise of growth and transformation. In 1887, when Thomas was 9 and Sarah was 7, Rachel discovered she was pregnant again. The pregnancy was unexpected but welcomed, and in early 1888 they welcomed another son, whom they named Daniel James. The addition of a new baby brought fresh chaos and joy to their household, and both Thomas and Sarah doted on their little brother with enthusiastic devotion. The ranch house, which had seemed spacious when it was just Rachel and Samuel, now buzzed with the noise and energy of a growing family. Meals were lively affairs with multiple conversations happening simultaneously. Evenings were spent together in the sitting room, Samuel reading to the children while Rachel worked on designs. The comfortable domestic seemed a far cry from the lonely months after the fire. By the time Daniel started walking, Thomas was old enough to take on real responsibilities on the ranch. He worked alongside his father with pride, learning not just the practical skills but the philosophy that Samuel brought to the work. Treat animals with respect, treat employees fairly, and never take success for granted. Sarah, meanwhile, had begun taking commissions of her own. Simple alterations at first but gradually more complex projects as her skills developed. Rachel watched her children grow with a mixture of pride and bittersweet awareness of time's passage. The little baby who had been Thomas Samuel was now a lanky preteen with his father's serious demeanor and gentle hands. Sarah was blossoming into a creative, confident girl who knew her own mind. And Daniel, sunny-natured and energetic, brought laughter wherever he went. Through it all, Rachel's relationship with Samuel remained the foundation everything else was built upon. They still stole moments alone when they could, riding out to the overlook or walking through the flower garden after the children were asleep. The passion of early love had evolved into something deeper and more enduring, a partnership forged through shared challenges and mutual respect. "You ever regret marrying a cowboy?" Samuel asked one night as they sat on the porch, the children finally asleep after a particularly chaotic bedtime. Rachel looked at him in surprise. "Never. What brought that on?" "I saw you working on that commission for the governor's wife today. You have so much talent, Rachel." "Sometimes I wonder if being out here on a ranch, raising children and mending ranch hands' shirts, is limiting what you could achieve." "Samuel Morgan, look at me." She waited until he met her eyes. "I have exactly the life I want. Yes, I love designing dresses, and yes, I am proud of the business I have built. But that is not separate from this life, from you and the children and this ranch. It is all woven together. I would not trade a single moment of it. You are sure?" "I am completely sure." She took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "You gave me more than help digging that day. You gave me hope that beauty could grow from devastation. You gave me love when I thought I was done with loving. You gave me a family and a home and a purpose. How could I ever regret that?" Samuel pulled her close, and they sat together in the peaceful darkness, the sounds of the Texas night surrounding them. These quiet moments, Rachel thought, were as precious as anything else. The simple comfort of being known and loved, of building a life alongside someone who understood both your strengths and your scars. As the 1890s approached, their family entered a new phase. Thomas, now a teenager, was increasingly independent, running parts of the ranch operation with minimal supervision. Sarah was 15 and receiving dress commission requests from across the state, her talent undeniable. Daniel, at 7, was still the family's source of constant entertainment and occasional exasperation, his boundless energy keeping everyone on their toes. Rachel was now in her late 30s, and Samuel had just turned 43. They were no longer the young couple who had planted flowers in burned earth, but they had grown together, aging in tandem, their love deepening with each passing year. There were gray threads in Rachel's brown hair now, and Samuel's temples were silver, but they wore their years with grace. In the summer of 1893, tragedy struck when Jack, their longtime ranch hand and friend, died suddenly from a heart ailment. The loss hit the family hard, especially Thomas, who had worked closely with Jack and considered him almost an uncle. The funeral was well attended, a testament to Jack's popularity in the community. After the burial, Samuel and Rachel walked to the flower garden, seeking solace in the place that had always represented renewal for them. The flowers were in full bloom, a riot of color against the green Texas landscape. "Life is so fragile," Rachel said, tears still wet on her cheeks. "Jack was healthy yesterday, and today he is gone." "It reminds us not to waste the time we have," Samuel replied, his own voice rough with grief. "To love fully while we can." They held each other among the flowers, drawing comfort from their shared presence. Later, they would return to the house and the children would continue with the daily work of living. But for that moment, they simply stood together, acknowledging loss while surrounded by the enduring symbol of their ability to create beauty from pain. The years continued their march. Thomas turned 20 in 1898, a capable young man who had grown into his father's legacy. He married a sweet-natured girl from Jefferson named Clara, and they built a small house on the edge of the ranch property. Sarah, at 18, had turned down multiple marriage proposals, declaring that she was perfectly happy focusing on her dress design business, though Rachel suspected her daughter had her eye on the new schoolteacher who had recently arrived in Jefferson. Daniel, now 12, was showing interest in both the ranch and his mother's design work, unable to decide which path called to him more. Samuel joked that they would have to split the boy in half to satisfy both enterprises, but Rachel knew their youngest would find his own way in time. Rachel herself was now 45, and sometimes she felt every year in her joints, especially on cold mornings. But her hands were still steady for the detailed embroidery work she loved, and her mind remained sharp, constantly developing new design concepts. Samuel was 50, his hair now more silver than brown, but he was still strong and vital, working the ranch with the same dedication he always had. They had survived and thrived, building an empire from determination and love. The flower garden remained their sacred space, carefully maintained and expanded over the years. What had started as a border of wildflowers was now a full garden with walking paths and a small bench where they often sat in the evenings. One particular evening in the spring of 1900, they sat on that bench watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. They had just celebrated their 23rd wedding anniversary, a quarter century since that first meeting in the ashes. 23 years, Rachel mused. It feels like both forever and no time at all. I know what you mean. Samuel's arm rested comfortably around her shoulders. Some days I still see that determined woman stabbing at the ground with a bent trowel, too stubborn to admit she needed help. And I see the kind stranger who stopped even though he had no reason to. Rachel leaned her head on his shoulder. What do you think would have happened if you had just ridden past that day? I do not know, and I am grateful I never have to find out. He kissed her temple softly. Everything good in my life traces back to that choice to stop and help. You, the children, this whole beautiful, complicated life we have built. It all started with flowers and ashes. New life from old ashes, Rachel whispered, the phrase that had become their personal motto. New life, Samuel agreed. They sat in peaceful silence as darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast Texas sky. Somewhere in the house behind them, they could hear Daniel practicing his fiddle, the notes occasionally hitting the right pitch. Sarah and Clara were probably cleaning up from supper, their voices carrying through the open windows. Thomas would be checking the barns one last time before bed, following his father's routines with comfortable familiarity. This was their legacy, Rachel thought. Not just the successful ranch or the thriving business, but this family, this love, this proof that life continued and grew even after devastating loss. She had been a widow standing in ashes, and Samuel had been a lonely rancher with too much land and too little purpose. Together, they had created something neither could have built alone. "I love you," she said, "not for the first time and certainly not for the last." "I love you too," Samuel replied, pulling her closer. "Always have, always will." As the new century began, their family continued to grow and change. Sarah finally admitted her feelings for the schoolteacher, a serious young man named Peter, and they married in a ceremony that Rachel designed all the dresses for. Daniel, after much deliberation, decided to split his time between the ranch and learning business management, with plans to eventually help expand Rachel's dress design operation into a full-scale manufacturing concern. Thomas and Clara welcomed their first child in 1901, a baby girl they named Rachel, after the grandmother who wept happy tears while holding her namesake. Samuel became a grandfather with all the enthusiasm he had brought to fatherhood, constantly finding excuses to visit Thomas and Clara's house to check on the baby. In 1903, Sarah gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, and the family joked that she had inherited her mother's efficiency, handling 2 children at once. Peter proved to be a devoted father, and the twins brought new energy to family gatherings. Daniel married in 1905 to a practical-minded woman named Martha who had a head for numbers, and helped him develop concrete plans for expanding the design business. By 1906, Morrison Designs had opened a small factory in Jefferson, employing a dozen seamstresses and producing ready-made dresses that were shipped throughout Texas and beyond. Through all these changes and expansions, Samuel and Rachel remained the heart of the family. Their ranch house became the gathering place for Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations, filled with children and grandchildren, and the noise of a family that had grown beyond anything they had imagined. In the spring of 1909, they returned to the flower garden to celebrate the 30th anniversary of their first meeting. Both of them were moving slower now, Samuel at 61 and Rachel at 56, but their love had not diminished. If anything, it had grown stronger, tempered by decades of partnership. 30 years, Samuel said, helping Rachel settle onto the bench that had become more necessity than choice as their joints protested prolonged standing. 3 decades since I saw a stubborn woman trying to plant flowers with inadequate tools. 3 decades since a kind cowboy stopped to help even though he had no obligation to. Rachel took his hand, the skin now loose and spotted with age but still warm and familiar. "Best decision I ever made, accepting that help. Best decision I ever made, offering it." They sat surrounded by the flowers they had planted and replanted over the years, the garden now mature and established, a permanent fixture on the landscape. Children's laughter drifted from the direction of the ranch house where their grandchildren were playing under the supervision of their parents. "You remember what you were thinking that day?" Rachel asked. "When you first saw me here?" Samuel considered the question. "I remember thinking you looked lost but determined, like you were fighting against something I could not see. It made me want to help, but more than that, it made me want to understand what could drive someone to plant flowers in a place of destruction." "And what did you conclude?" "That hope is the most powerful force in the world. You were planting hope, even if you did not realize it at the time." He squeezed her hand gently. "You taught me that rebuilding starts with small acts of faith, one seed at a time, one day at a time." Rachel felt tears sting her eyes, moved by his words and by the weight of all the years they represented. "We have had a good life, Samuel. The best life," he agreed. "And it is not over yet. We have years ahead of us still." He was right. Though they had slowed down, neither of them was finished. Samuel still oversaw the ranch operations, though Thomas handled most of the daily management. Rachel still designed dresses, though Sarah and Daniel managed the business side. They were transitioning into elder status with the same partnership that had characterized their entire marriage. The years from 1909 to 1915 were peaceful and productive. The ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's management. Morrison Designs expanded to a second location in Dallas. The grandchildren grew, and two more were added to the family when Daniel and Martha had a son, and Thomas and Clara welcomed their third child. Samuel and Rachel became the family's living repository of history and wisdom. Grandchildren would seek them out for stories about the old days, about how Texas had changed, about the origins of their family's success. Samuel always steered these conversations back to the flower garden, to the moment when everything had changed. "Your grandmother was the bravest person I ever met," he would tell them. "She lost everything and still chose to plant flowers. That is the lesson I want you to remember. When life knocks you down, you plant flowers. You create beauty. You choose hope." In the fall of 1915, Samuel fell ill with pneumonia. The doctors warned that at 67, recovery would be difficult. Rachel barely left his side during the 3 weeks he spent in bed, applying cool cloths to his fever, spooning broth into him when he could eat, holding his hand through the worst of it. "You are not leaving me," she told him fiercely during a particularly bad night when his breathing became labored. "We have more years ahead of us, more springs to see those flowers bloom. You are not done yet, Samuel Morgan." Whether it was her determination, his own stubbornness, or simple luck, Samuel rallied. By late November, he was out of bed and slowly recovering his strength. The illness aged him, though, leaving him frailer than before. But his mind remained sharp and his love for Rachel as constant as ever. They celebrated Christmas of 1915 surrounded by their enormous family. 3 generations gathered in the ranch house that had been expanded multiple times to accommodate everyone. Rachel looked around at the faces of her children, their spouses, her grandchildren, and felt overwhelmed by gratitude. "What are you thinking?" Samuel asked, seated beside her at the head of the long table. "That I am blessed beyond measure, that from ashes and despair came all of this." She gestured at their family. "How did we get so lucky?" "It was not luck. It was choice. We chose hope, we chose love, and we chose to build something that would last." He raised his glass and the family quieted, sensing a toast. "To Rachel, the bravest woman I know, and to all of you, the living proof that from old ashes comes new life. New life from old ashes." The family echoed, and the toast became family tradition from that night forward. The winter of 1915 passed, and spring arrived with its usual promise of renewal. Samuel, now mostly recovered but permanently weakened, spent his days on the porch or in the flower garden, content to watch rather than work. Rachel stayed close, their conversations as rich as ever even if their activities were more limited. In May, on the 36th anniversary of their meeting, the entire family gathered at the flower garden. It had become tradition over the years to mark this date, but this year felt special, weighted with significance. Thomas gave a speech about his parents' legacy. Sarah read a poem she had written about growth and transformation. Daniel presented them with a professionally painted sign that read, "Morgan Flower Garden ESD, 1879, where new life springs from old ashes." The sign was installed at the garden's entrance, and Rachel wept happy tears while Samuel held her close. They posed for a photograph, the whole family arranged around them in the flower garden, 3 generations united by the love of 2 people who had chosen hope in a place of destruction. That photograph would hang in the ranch house for generations, a reminder of where the family's story truly began. Not with success or wealth, but with one woman planting flowers and one man offering to help her dig. Everything else had grown from that single act of determined hope. Samuel lived another 3 years, dying peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1918 at the age of 70. Rachel, at 65, grieved deeply, but without the desperate edge that had characterized her mourning for Thomas so many decades before. Samuel had given her nearly 40 years of love and partnership, and she carried those memories like treasures, pulling them out in quiet moments and warming herself with their glow. She continued living at the ranch, surrounded by family, still designing the occasional dress, but mostly enjoying the role of matriarch. She spent hours in the flower garden, tending the blooms that had started it all, talking to Samuel as if he could hear her. "The bluebonnets are especially beautiful this year," she would say, sitting on their bench. "Thomas brought the new baby to see them yesterday. Your great-grandson, Samuel, named for you. He has your eyes." She lived another 12 years, dying in her sleep in 1930 at the age of 77. The family buried her beside Samuel on a hill overlooking the flower garden, the two of them together again in death as they had been in life. The flower garden continued to bloom each spring, maintained by children and grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. The sign Daniel had commissioned remained at the entrance, weathering but still legible, "Where new life springs from old ashes." The Morgan family, which had started with a widow and a cowboy choosing hope in the aftermath of fire, grew into a dynasty in East Texas. The ranch prospered through the generations, and Morrison Designs eventually became a nationally recognized brand. But the family never forgot its origins, never forgot that their entire legacy traced back to one spring day in 1879, when Rachel Morrison decided to plant flowers where her house had burned, and Samuel Morgan decided to stop and help her dig. Every family gathering ended with the toast Samuel had started, "New life from old ashes." And every new generation learned the story of the flower garden, of the love that bloomed there, of the proof that with hope and help and determination, beautiful things can grow from the most devastating losses. The flower garden itself became a local landmark, visited by townspeople and travelers who had heard the story. People would come to see where the Morgan family had started, would stand among the wildflowers, and imagine that fateful meeting. Some came seeking inspiration for their own struggles, hoping to absorb some of the hope that seemed to permeate the place. In 1979, on the 100th anniversary of Rachel and Samuel's meeting, the family held a massive celebration at the ranch. Morgans traveled from across the country to attend, all of them descendants of that original union. The flower garden was in full bloom, the wildflowers as vibrant as ever, and a new sign was unveiled beside the original, this one reading, "A century of growth in memory of Rachel and Samuel Morgan, who taught us to plant hope." The story had become legend by then, embellished slightly by 100 years of retelling but remaining essentially true. A woman had lost everything to fire. A cowboy had stopped to help her plant flowers in the ashes. They had fallen in love and built an empire, proving that endings are just beginnings in disguise. And every spring, without fail, the flowers bloomed again, a living testament to the truth Samuel had spoken on that first day. From old ashes comes new life. Always and forever, new life from old ashes.